Seventh day, Upper Fire Month, 1 CE. Are you certain this is safe?
No.
Florine glanced down at the rock beside her foot. The rock didn't miss her look.
The world is not a safe place, the rock told her. That might have been true, but it was no reason to make things even more unsafe.
Then again, the rock had nowhere else to go. A day previous, the first compliance violation, at least that was what Isaraku called it, from the tribes was reported. Since she instructed the administration not to act against the tribes on such issues before she had a chance to review them, they were spared immediate obliteration. Once she finished her work and prepared to set off to address the ongoing violation, she was surprised to find that Bubibi didn't want to go. On that ominous note, she left the Dale of Defiance with Isaraku, Leolio, and the vampire bride. They traveled roughly 80 kilometers southwest, arriving at what she thought may as well have been an alien world. Florine's boots shifted in the sand as she took in the panorama around her. To the north was the Abelian River, and near the horizon to the south was a dry grassland that stretched to Evenso according to her map. Between them was a vast, sandy landscape covering roughly that she mistook for odd-looking hills from a distance. She eventually came to realize that they were sand dunes, but unlike the dunes that one might see along a stretch of river or on the Empire's northwestern coast, the dunes here were colossal. The one that she stood upon was over 300 meters high. A swirl of sand moving over the slopes below marked the passage of an air elemental. Further down, a veil of smoke rose into the night, illuminated by countless small wildfires consuming the dried-out spring growth along the eastern edge of the dune field. Even from their distance, Florine could see the swarms of cinder elementals birthed by the process and encouraging its continued propagation. "It's happening," the rock beside her foot said. Over one particularly prodigious blaze, the cloud of cinder elementals coalesced and flared into a single bright point of fiery light. The rocks around Florine cried out, "Oh! We are blessed! Praise be to Ixablad!" The light dimmed slightly, stabilizing to reveal a newborn fire elemental. Cheers rose as it resumed the task of the cinder elementals with voracious vigor, praising the elements and Ixablad. Not long after the fire elemental set a small stand of saplings ablaze, however, a patch of dirt rolled over and gave it a whack. The voices of the rocks grew to a fevered pitch as the fire elemental clashed with the newly arrived earth elemental in a bout of primal fury. Isaraku's pen ceased its scrawling. "If elementals are to be considered citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom," it said, "should we not move to put an end to this violence?" The cheering suddenly stopped. All around them, the rocks shifted as if to regard the Elder Lich. The awkward silence continued as Florine's mind worked to come up with a suitable answer. But what was suitable? The longer she worked in the Abelian Hills, the more she realized how different it was from the society she had been brought up to function in. Perhaps the closest thing to an education in the elements came from her religious studies, but that education had little to no bearing on the practices of the demi-human tribes. Broadly speaking, the faith of the four elemental gods was a religion tailored to human society and thus framed things in ways that could be understood by that society. Its mandates were more often than not delivered through allegory, and the elemental aspects of the faith were delivered through symbolism and metaphor, which were in turn applied to daily life. To a human congregation existing in an exclusively human society, everything made sense and no one questioned the teachings of the temples. It was simply the truth and everyone knew it. The relationship between earth and fire is. It didn't work. Nothing she could think of worked. What the demi-human tribes venerated were the primal forces of nature. The faith of the four had no relevance to them, and the teachings of the faith did nothing for the present situation. Those teachings were all about how the elements factored into human society in a countless variety of small ways, and she understood now that it was a faith that still put humans on top of everything. Humans worshipped the four elemental gods and, through that worship, they attempted to influence the elements, praying for rain, fertile harvests, calm weather, and anything else that might help with their lives. For all of its efforts to distance itself from the faith of the six, the faith of the four still probably seemed no different from an outsider's perspective. Nothing related to the faith of the four's interpretation of the elements would make any sense whatsoever to the tribes of the Abelian Hills. More importantly, the elementals themselves wouldn't care a whit about what the faith of the four had to say about them. Florine looked down at the rock near her foot. The rock was in reality the dorsal fin of Arust, a member of a race of shark demi-humans that inhabited the sands of what locals called the Creeping Dunes. Could you explain the relationship between the elementals here? She asked.
I do not know what you are asking, the Rust, a male who went by the name Dry Bubble, said. It is what it is. The elements are always thus, and so shall they will always be. What does that even mean?
The administration still needs information to act upon,
Florine said.
Laws need to be established for the government to function smoothly.
But there are already laws, Dry Bubble replied.
Elementals do not stop being elementals simply because you say they are not. Fire burns. Water flows.
That may be true, but we are also charged with the realm's security.
We need to know at what point intervention is required. What if these fires erupt everywhere and elementals pop up to burn everything?
That would not happen, Dry Bubble told her.
The earth elementals bury them before they get very far.
Ixablat has always been this way.
What exactly is Ixablat?
The cycle of cinders.
The sowing of glass.
Without Ixablat, our people, as well as all others who depend on it, would perish. Why is that?
We are creatures of the sun and of the land.
Fire and earth.
That was a bit poetic sounding. Poetic. Now that she thought about it, nearly all of the residents of the Abelian Hills that she had met so far spoke the same way. The only exceptions were some of the Xian, like King BBZ who had interacted extensively with humans before, and the Dark Dwarves, who weren't a part of the same societal sphere. Florine was so focused on producing something workable for the Sorceress Kingdom that she had perhaps leaned too far in favor of the way that the administration perceived and rationalized things. Which was to say very literal and simplistic, especially when one considered how complex the world could be. In contrast, considering how pervasive the patterns of translation appeared to be between all of the different races she had spoken with so far, it grew increasingly likely that she was missing something that everyone else either heard or intrinsically understood. When culture and language combined, a surprising amount of information could be contained within what might otherwise be perceived as a simple phrase through the way that the world translated speech. To make things worse, arrogant individuals were quick to assume that the person attempting to communicate with them was unsophisticated, stupid, or both.
With what fruit does Ixablat bless the land?
Florine asked.
The sand under her feet stirred.
Dry Bubble surfaced, revealing a 4-meter-long form that resembled a fish loricated in overlapping sandstone plates. The vampire bride placed herself between Florine and the Rust as it opened a mouth large enough to bite a human in half. Florine wrinkled her nose at the indescribable odor, once again wondering why everything in the Abelian Hills had so many teeth.
What are we looking at?
Despite having his mouth wide open, Dry Bubble had no problems speaking. The seeds of Ixablat may be seen between my teeth. Florine leaned forward to find what he was referring to. After that, she exchanged looks with the vampire bride. Then, as one, they looked over at Isoroku. The elder lich let out a dry sigh, coming forward to pick out a piece of glass. It held the object in front of its skeletal face for a closer look.
Is that obsidian?
Florine asked. In their region, the Draconic Kingdom was the primary source of obsidian. The material was plentiful in the country's southern provinces and had various ornamental and martial applications. While raw obsidian was common, high-quality obsidian goods tended to fetch a high price. Something told her that her assumption was off, so she took a closer look. No, that's wrong. This is far more valuable than obsidian. Appraisal magic item. A moment passed before the elder lich lowered the shard of black glass. This is not obsidian, it said. It is a magical material known as elemental glass. Eh? Florine blinked. Isn't elemental glass extremely rare? Elemental glass was roughly on par with mithril if one were to rank different materials into tiers. While mithril could be mined in the region, however, elemental glass only occasionally appeared in small quantities on the caravans that crossed the Great Steppe. It was so expensive that it was usually only purchased by institutions such as the Imperial Ministry of Magic and its counterparts in the Slain Theocracy. She scanned the ground for more samples, but all she could see was sand. May we keep this fragment for analysis? Florine asked. If that is your wish, Dry Bubble answered. The shard of elemental glass disappeared into Isoroku's inventory. They could have at least cleaned it off, first. Florine considered the valuable find. The thumbnail-sized piece of elemental glass was worth upwards of 20 platinum trade coins if one was patient. She had spotted several dozen such fragments, some of them even larger,
in Dry Bubble's mouth. In his mouth? You have quite a few of these, Florine said. What do you use them for? He mentioned the sowing of glass, but she had never heard of elemental glass being planted to grow anything. They are seeds of elemental energy, Dry Bubble answered. The rust absorbed that energy to live. So you're eating it? In your terms, it is a good way to describe it. This wasn't in the notes at all. The administration's documentation of the rust only noted that they consumed relatively little and thus represented less of an economic burden to the country while existing on the Sorceress Kingdom's welfare efforts. Florine couldn't puzzle out how such large creatures subsisted off of so little, but it now appeared that she had tripped over the answer. As you've noted, Florine said, humans don't eat that way. Could you explain to me how it works? Dry Bubble settled back under the sand. The taking of life draws the energy out of Ixablat seeds. Blood becomes infused with the power of the elements and the rust draw life from that energy. How long does it take to draw out all of the energy from one of Ixablat's seeds? If it is the size of the one just now, 2 or 3 years, perhaps. Since you had so many, Florine noted, does that mean you're relatively well off? Well off? It means that your lifestyle is one of abundance. The rust's rocky fin shifted from side to side in the sand. My life is not at risk by you taking one seed, he said, but neither are my people experiencing a time of abundance. We are a race that finds nourishment far in advance. What you saw in my mouth was the result of decades of sifting through the bottom of the dunes. Dry Bubble's fin turned toward the elementals battling below them. The blessing that you see today will be accessible to the rust far in the future, when the sands creep westward to cover the site of this clash between the elements. Do you now understand why we cannot comply with your territorial assignment? Yes, Florine said, I believe so. You may continue living as you have. I will communicate your circumstances to the administration. With that, she parted ways with the rust and started the journey back to the Dale of Defiance. Along the way, she considered what the most recent interaction had brought to light. For lack of a better way to put it, the rust were not a race that could stay in one place. More precisely, it was their habitat that moved. Countless centuries ago, the creeping dunes were said to be closer to the coast, but they were blown inland by winds from the sea. Now, they were far enough inland for the winds sweeping over the southern border ranges to influence their movement. Far, far in the future, the sands would be encroaching on the borders of Avasha or the slain theocracy. Though the creeping dunes only moved a few meters a year, the fastidious elder liches of the administration noticed that the rust were violating the limits of their assigned territory centimeter by centimeter. The recognition of what was necessary to the rust as a compliance violation served to underscore how rigid the administration's agents were. Furthermore, it also made Florine aware of how dependent human laws were on being able to exercise control over the lands in which they dwelt. Everything hinged on reality matching what culture and law assumed was reality, and humans went to great lengths to make that reality true. But what would a life without that societal framework be like? She supposed that the human countries in the Irantal region were, in a way, the answer. The history that she was brought up learning asserted that the human countries in the region were the result of a slow process in which the human race was driven to the far reaches of the world by its demi-human and heteromorphic rivals. They finally ended up where they were because the other races considered plains the least desirable habitat. This led to the saying humans live in the plains, which was considered common sense in the region. Of course, as a merchant who knew many people who had traveled beyond the Great Steppe, Florine knew that humans existed elsewhere in the world and could live side by side with their so-called rivals. One didn't even have to go that far. The city-state alliance was right next to the Baharuth Empire and hosted dozens of different species that existed as part of the same society. What could instead be asserted was that monoracial human states might not exist outside of the Irantal region. The reason why they did exist in their little corner of the world was that it was a place where humans could finally establish a civilization that functioned purely on the rules of a human society. A more cynical individual might say that humans ran from reality until they found some place where they could create their own without interference. Speaking of interference, we'll need to develop enhanced security measures for the creeping dunes, Florine said. For what purpose? Isoroku asked. Not to stop the elementals, of course, Florine answered. The annual cycle of elements here produces an essential resource for the inhabitants of the creeping dunes.
It didn't need protection before now because no one knows how valuable the results of that process are. If even the smallest whisper of what's here gets out, people will come to investigate. Rumor of being able to simply pick up an entire lifetime's worth of wealth off of the ground was bound to draw interest. Florine had always dismissed tales of people finding untapped wealth under the noses of ignorant or savage tribes, but she had always dismissed them as flights of fancy. It turned out that there might be some truth to those tales, but, now, she could only consider how much damage they could cause. Also, Florine said, this may represent an opportunity for the Sorcerer's Kingdom, economically speaking. If trustworthy experts could study and figure out how the process behind the formation of elemental glass works, we would be able to produce a resource not found anywhere else in the region. Additionally, the administration would need to consider what would happen when the creeping dunes started to leave the Abelian wilderness. The laws of Rheastis had no provisions for territories that moved around, so neither did the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Fortunately, that was a concern for the distant future. The distant future, huh? If the creeping sands continued moving at the claimed rate, it would take 10,000 years for it to reach the border. It was not a problem that a human would ever consider, but, for her. Florine's hand absently went to the infinite haversack on her right hip. If she ever figured out how to make the strange box that Lady Sholtier gave her work, then that distant future would still be within her lifetime. Grasping that future was still beyond her, but she still pondered what it might be like from time to time. The exercise only left her feeling the unfathomable weight that eternity might represent. The idea of immortality was not foreign to the human imagination. There were more than a few stories that revolved around those who had obtained it. Generally speaking, they tended to focus on one thing: freedom. Freedom from age and infirmity, the freedom of unlimited time. If one was immortal, one could supposedly go anywhere and achieve anything. Of course, some downsides were presented, such as having to watch one's friends and family grow old and pass away, but, for the most part, immortality was portrayed as a relatively carefree affair with a mountain of attractive perks. When Florine thought about it, however, all she could think of was her work. There was something to be said for being able to see through efforts that might take lifetimes to realize, but this also meant that she would also be made to witness the results of whatever screw-ups she made. She could decide to pursue a policy that seemed like a good idea, and then discover how much of a disaster it was 2 centuries later. With this in mind, she thought she could understand why the royal court behaved the way that it did. There was a drastic difference between how quickly it processed enacted legislation and how long it deliberated over new legislation. By and large, they had a very passive approach to things by human standards, prioritizing the collection of information as the different facets of society went about their daily business. This, in turn, felt like it put most of the pressure on the middle management of the realm, namely the nobles, guildmasters, and other local leaders of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. It was harrowing at first when no one knew what might happen if what they did resulted in a less than ideal outcome or was an outright failure, but time showed them the nuances of their new royal court. Everything was data that could be analyzed to optimize governance. Failure was not punished simply because it had occurred, but judged according to a sliding scale of severity and expectation. In short, what mattered was that no laws were broken, resources were used appropriately, and useful data was generated. This, in turn, was planting the seeds of a culture where people were encouraged to experiment, weren't afraid of failure, and were expected to hold themselves accountable for their actions. According to Lady Sholtier, it was a policy put forth by the Sorcerer King himself, refined and codified by the royal court to be applied to the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Strangely, the royal court seemed to have a harder time embracing that policy than the rest of the country, and they were still very much averse to personal failure. People like Leanne and Clara might have embraced the policy with too much energy, launching dozens of small initiatives in addition to the ones that they were most well known for, or perhaps it was better to say that the initiatives that they were most well known for were the ones that succeeded. Failure, however, could not be tolerated in some situations. Florine's task in the Abelian wilderness was one of them. Thus, she decided to adopt the royal court's cautious and thorough approach to domestic governance. Though her time working in the area so far was short, that approach had already helped her avoid several calamitous decisions that she otherwise might have made. On the way back to the Dale of Defiance, they came across a curious sight. A pod of Monachini was half swimming, half flopping their way up the Abelian River in the early morning light. She had her entourage travel along the river to take a closer look. The Monachini quickly noticed her passage and came over to greet her. Florian Cadia Dale Gagne, a Monachini that she somehow managed to recognize as Urforu, said, "It pleases us to see you." "Good morning, Elder," Florian smiled. "What brings you to this part of the Abelian Hills?" "The barbed urchin tribe has come to deliver its tribute," Urforu said. "Tribute?" Urforu let out an odd-sounding bark. "Indeed. The schools of fish begin to return. You have delivered on your promise. We have come to offer our gratitude, and our apologies for doubting your sincerity." Behind the Monachini elder, she spotted 4 of the semi-aquatic demi-humans carrying a small chest between them. The chest itself appeared to be of human make. Florian wasn't sure she wanted to know how they had gotten their hands on it. The demi-humans came forward, placing the chest at her feet and opening it to reveal a vibrant variety of corals, shells, and pearls. "I don't mean to sound rude," Florian said, "but tribute is unnecessary. I am here to serve the people of the Abelian Hills, not to glean wealth from them." "But what you have done would have required a war to accomplish for our people," Urforu protested. "It must have cost you much. The barbed urchin tribe is not a tribe of ingrates." Florian imagined that it had only taken a notification that the actions of Roble and its allies were in violation of the spirit of the treaties between their 2 countries. Lady Albedo didn't fly over and threaten to whack Prince Caspond with her scepter, probably. Additionally, between the case with the merfolk and their reaction to Bubibi, it made Florian aware of one other thing. To the Monachini, as well as many of the tribes of the Abelian wilderness, the cultivation of geopolitical power was a foreign concept. Every political action that a tribe, clan, or petty kingdom took in the Abelian wilderness was done directly through an exercise of martial might, and it was performed against their neighbors as a form of naturalistic competition against their closest rivals rather than one of nation building. But how could she explain that? It wasn't as if she could regurgitate a noble's education on the hapless Monachini standing on the riverbank. Moreover, there was something far more important that she needed to establish first. "The barbed urchin tribe you may be," Florian said, "but you are also something else. Now, you are citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom. This is not the same as being subjected to a conqueror's whims and being expected to pay tribute for every act of protection. As citizens, you are afforded the protection of His Majesty and encouraged to participate in the society we are in the process of creating." "That's right. Before anything else, there must be trust." A healthy society required trust for proper development. Not only trust in the government and its institutions, but also trust between its individual members. Trust opened doors and provided access to resources that otherwise could not be obtained. Creating a culture of trust encouraged productive cooperation and was far more effective at policing a country than any number of death knights. And, if one considered things through the lens of eternity, trust meant that an immortal administration could enjoy support that transcended any adversity, change in policy, or even the wholesale change in systems brought about by the ebb and flow of eons. It was yet another critical lesson learned from their time in the Draconic Kingdom. Urforu exchanged a look with her fellows. Florian wondered what her words meant to them. At her shoulder, Isaraku cleared its throat. "While tribute may not be necessary," the elder lich said, "we would still like to analyze the materials brought before us." Florian smiled and rolled her eyes at Isaraku's pragmatic request. "We'll pay for it, of course," she said. "On that note, there are a few things I would like to discuss with you in the Dale of Defiance." "Boss, something's happening." Philagram looked up from his reading, tilting his head slightly to look out of the entrance of the pavilion. The owner of the voice didn't appear, and neither did it look like preparations were being made to receive anyone. He set down the papers in his hand before reaching out to grab his helmet. A minute later, he strode out into the night, finding the dwarf that had spoken standing at the campfire nearby. "Where?" Philagram asked. "At the harbor," the dwarf answered. "That woman's brought in a bunch of seals from the coast." "What are they doing?" "Dunno. Something. Normally, he'd beat him bloody for being so unspecific. Here, however, it was always something. The human woman and her undead minions were always up to one stupid thing or another. He stopped trying to figure out why days ago. There were a few things that he could immediately understand, such as restarting trade, upgrading security procedures, and establishing rule of law. Other things, such as cultivating understanding, promoting trust and goodwill, laying the foundations for a harmonious society and ensuring that people were happy, didn't make a lick of sense. All that mattered was crime and punishment. Anyone that didn't toe the line volunteered to serve as an example to the rest. His guards fell into step behind him and walked out of the camp. On the way, he sneered at what he saw from his people. This was the longest that they had been in any given place at one time. Everyone was getting too comfortable. Life as an exile was supposed to be penance for one's crimes. He needed to devise something to improve the quality of suffering. Falagrim made his way past the outer security perimeter of the Dale of Defiance, heading straight toward the riverbank and through the ongoing construction of the humans' proposed market. Several dozen buildings had already been completed, including shaded sections for stalls that filled the 3 terraces cut out of the slope. A few fountains had also been raised, a convenience that was offered free of charge to visitors, which were fed by simple magic items. The overflow trickled into channels that wound down through the market sections and eventually spilt into the harbor. Now, the human was trying to add greenery and flowers to the market rows because she thought it would make the place nicer. The tread of his iron-shod boots echoed off of the sensible dwarven architecture that was slated to be ruined by the woman's nonsensical sensibilities. At the end of the market's central lane was the harbor, which wouldn't work, but that wasn't any of his business, and there he found a pod of monocini in the water, their heads bobbing up and down as they looked up attentively at the human. At the human's feet was a small chest of gold coins. Falagrim joined Agni, who was standing a short distance away with a pair of his merchants. "What's going on?" "Sounds like the problem the seals were having with the merfolk was resolved," Agni said. "They came to offer tribute, but that woman paid them for it instead." "Huh? What are those damned seals going to do with a bunch of coins?" "She's trying to get them on board with her market idea," one of the merchants said. "But it's going as well as you'd think." That much was obvious. The demi-humans didn't have a single merchant among them. What the demi-humans once traded with the Dark Dwarves for was the means to survive against their neighbors. Now that the Sorceress Kingdom had enforced its arbitrary, unnatural peace upon the Abelian Hills, the tribes saw no need for trade. The most ridiculous part was that the human could easily get the tribes to participate in trade, but she refused to use the full extent of her powers to do so. After observing her actions at the border of the Holy Kingdom, he was finally able to figure out what she was. The human woman was a diplomancer, an extremely troublesome type of person that could get whatever she wanted by simply speaking to others. Since diplomacy was oratory in nature, things like magic resistance or immunity to mind-affecting abilities didn't work against it. All that mattered was how believable they were and whether the people listening to them knew what was going on. The latter only mattered if the listener was strong enough to do something about it. The human also demonstrated the ability to use her powers in a command-like way. This either meant that she had the raw power to force others to listen to her, or was skilled enough to efficiently harness the limited power that she possessed. With all that in mind, her mostly mundane efforts with the tribes of the Abelian Hills could only be considered a foolish waste of time. The hell would they bring to trade, anyway? Falagrim muttered. "Well, it isn't as if they don't have anything to sell at all," the merchant said. "Fish and such would just rot on the way, of course, but the tribute that they delivered was filled with things that the tribes could use to make trinkets. The problem's that it's not a huge market. Demand for trinkets is nowhere near what demand for equipment used to be." Falagrim snorted, looking over his shoulder at the overambitious expanse of the market. It would look wretched indeed if only 3% of the place could be filled. "Our merchants will be working here, as well," Agni noted. "The demi-humans might try to pawn that stuff off on us for tools and such. Ba'awin didn't send us anyone that can fashion jewelry." "Would it be possible to have some join us from home?" the merchant asked. "We can only fabricate so many crimes before arousing suspicion," Falagrim said. The latest set of exiles delivered to them not only contained genuine exiles, but several artisans sent to help establish an economic foothold on the surface. Before that point, Falagrim's company consisted of criminals, the wardens sent to ensure that the criminals remained where they were supposed to be, and merchants to work the slave trade. It had barely been a week since they started construction in the Dale of Defiance, so not much had been done about getting the market going. To make it worse, the human woman insisted on creating her jolly little community in the Abelian wilderness. Trade with other regions would be restricted until she got the locals on their feet. Supposedly, This was to prevent the poor, ignorant locals from being exploited by foreign merchants. All Felagrim could do was play along. She was the one with the army, after all. What do you mean the harbor won't work? The human's voice came from the wharf. Is there something you don't like about it? It's not a matter of like, one of the Monachini replied. The Abelian River is shallow for most of the year. If the ships you speak of are similar to the ones that the humans in the West use, they will get stuck. I planned on having channels made for the cataracts and other shallow parts of the river, the human said. But that does not change the volume of water that flows down the river, the Monachini told her. If you did channels, then the river will flow into those channels and not run its regular course. You will destroy that which so many rely on to live. The human released a disappointed sigh. Felagrim was hoping her delusion would go on for long enough to see her try sending ships downriver. In that case, the human said, what about the harbor itself? Is it suitable for use by aquatic demi-humans when they come and visit the market? It is much better than what we were accustomed to when we came here in the past. However, if you want many to dwell in this place, it will have to be much bigger, or perhaps different ones could be fashioned. You desire the people of this land to coexist, but it is not simply a matter of saying so. Prey species will not feel safe around predators. Predators cannot tolerate the presence of their rivals. It is instinct. But if that's true, the human said, how is it that many races can coexist elsewhere? Predators and prey alike. We do not know these places of which you speak, so we cannot. Felagrim tensed as an unsettling feeling swept over him. The Monachini in the harbor submerged as one in a collective panic, splashing the human with water. Felagrim's merchants and laborers fled as a huge shadow crossed over the harbor and the world itself seemed to whisper their coming demise as it passed. The shadow crossed over them 2 more times before a frost dragon alighted beside the human, sending a cloud of dust over the wharf. The human looked up at it with a cross look. Kilistran, she said, you're not supposed to do that. Do what? The dragon asked. Scaring people like that. The soaked human answered. Oh. Sorry. I'm used to landing over at the cargo lot. Why did you come here, anyway? The vampire brides over there said that this delivery should come to where you were? The vampire beside the human came forward and started unstrapping the satchels secured to the frost dragon. Despite just recently displaying her displeasure, the human reached up to stroke the dragon affectionately along the side of her neck. Felagrim imagined the thing biting off her arm, but the world wasn't such an accommodating place. Once all of the satchels were on the ground, the human knelt to withdraw several items with the dragon looking curiously over her shoulder. The first was a potted plant, followed by another potted plant, which was followed by another. Great. The Sorceress Kingdom uses dragons to deliver flowers. What are those for? The dragon asked. I'm going to decorate the market with them, the human answered. Don't you think it will look wonderful? The frost dragon raised its head, eyeing the nearby terraces. Are you sure about that? She said. What do you mean? Well, those plants don't belong here, do they? The Abelian Hills is a mix of sparse woodland, shrublands, badlands, and savannas. In short, it's a sort of arid, hilly steppe. Those plants you're pulling out, on the other hand, are from the Erantal area. So it won't look wonderful. It looks wonderful to you, the dragon said, and I suppose that also means it would look wonderful to the local humans, but there are no other local humans, are there? Those plants probably won't be very happy baking out here, either. The human's shoulders slumped. I'm a horrible person, aren't I? Even when I resolve to make a nice place for everyone, it turns out that I'm just trying to make a nice place for myself. There's nothing particularly wrong with that, the dragon said. All races do it to some degree, though I suppose that humans often demonstrate a tendency to overdo it. I don't want to overdo it, the human said. I just wanted to improve the scenery a bit. It never occurred to me that the scenery might be fine as it is. Do you think it's possible? To create a place that's agreeable to everyone, I mean. It's impossible to make everywhere agreeable to everyone. I can't imagine why you'd even try. Why not just let your minions sort themselves out? That's what we dragons do. They're not my minions. They're citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom and it's my responsibility as an administrator to figure out how to bring them together in a good way. I'm still of the same opinion, the dragon told her. Let them figure out what they want. While you may know a thing or two about them, you are, in the end, not them. I would hardly be pleased if someone went off on their own and decided what I did and didn't prefer. Ruling is not controlling, Lady Garnier. My late husband rarely stuck his nose into the Quagoas' affairs, and they did more than well enough. With that, the frost dragon took wing, rapidly receding into a speck in the evening sky. The Monachini resurfaced several minutes later, gaping up at the human. "Just how strong are you?" the elder asked. "All we could do was quake in fear at the bottom of the harbor, waiting to be fished up as a meal." "Must it be a matter of strength?" the human answered. "I've known Kilistran for over a year now, and I consult with her about certain things once in a while. Speaking of which, can you think of anything that would make this harbor more attractive for your people?" "Attractive? Well, I believe waves would be nice." "Waves? The inlands are so hot and dry," another Mokanini said. "More water would make things cooler." "Add beds of kelp." "Beds? I don't know what kelp is." "The shelf here is tall and sharp. A beach of gravel or sand would be more comfortable." Falagram shook his head as the human was buried in a mountain of suggestions. None of them included flowers. "What do you think?" Agni asked. "I think she's going to grow old and die before she accomplishes anything of note," Falagram answered. "Or maybe she is one of the undead after all." With little more to see, he turned away to examine his people's work. Agni and the two merchants joined him. They were supposed to learn more about the Sorceress Kingdom so they could figure out how to turn things to their advantage, but their representative's insistence on enacting her weird tribal protectionism was slowing everything down to a snail's pace. Since things were the way they were, he then thought he could do some business in Roblé and take advantage of the demand created by their recovery efforts. However, their visit to the border left him with the sense that those in authority would unfairly use it to basically steal his goods. "Master Falagrin." He stopped and turned to find the human following after them, raising her skirts daintily as she scaled the steps leading up terraces. "My contacts got back to me on the equipment that I sent to them for assessment," the human said. "They've expressed their interest in purchasing your inventory as an educational aid." "An educational aid?" Falagrim wrinkled his nose. "That's right," she smiled and nodded. "The vast majority of artisans in the duchy are humans who only have experience filling orders for human clients. Your goods have been crafted for a wide variety of races and hold great value as instructional pieces." With a jerk of his head, Falagrim motioned for his merchants to deal with the human. He went to stand in the shadow of a nearby building with a sour look. It wasn't as if they had any control over what happened to their goods after they were sold, but who in the world initiated a trade saying that they wanted to copy the other party's work? "Not listening in?" Agni said. "I'm in no mood to listen to grown dwarves getting manhandled by a girl who shouldn't even be out of her family's hold yet," Falagrim grumbled. "I'm sure she won't do anything that's strictly to our detriment," his sister-in-law told him. "At least not according to her point of view. That just makes it worse. Anyone can pretend to act nice, we're here to see what she's hiding under that silk glove of hers." Between the way that the representative conducted herself and the sterile responses of the undead, it was impossible to tell what the true objectives of the Sorceress Kingdom were. All that he could discern was that, even if the country had evil necromancers in charge, they were shrewd enough to use everything at their disposal, regardless of their moral stance. Not 5 minutes later, the merchants came back to him. One dropped a bag of coins into Falagrim's outstretched palm. "So," he said, "what can we do with this?" "In terms of supplies," one of the merchants replied, "it's enough to sustain the company for over a decade on the surface. The food prices here are especially cheap. We can purchase enough fuel and ore to keep the camp's smiths busy for just as long," the other merchant added. "I believe that you would know better than I as to what the people here use outside of warfare," the human said as she came to join them. "Have you gone through the list of surviving tribes?" "Yeah," Falagrim replied, "and most of our biggest customers aren't on it. Not that it matters with your ban on raiding. I don't know how it hasn't sunk into that gilded head of yours yet, but we're talking about demi-humans here. They're born naturally equipped to deal with everything that everyday life demands of them. The tribes don't do anything advanced enough to require tools from us." The human crossed her arms under her breasts, casting a glance at the merchants. "But don't you think it's the perfect opportunity to help them?" "Huh? Help? Humans and dwarves aren't born with powerful natural weapons and armor, the human said. Thus, we are driven to innovate solutions, to fashion tools and other equipment. What we must do in order to survive serves as a gateway to industry and economy. Demi-human tribes, on the other hand, are much less likely to develop in that direction because, as you say, they don't need to. They're stuck doing what they're doing because what they are born with precludes the need to do anything else. With how protective you are about their way of life, Philagram noted, I figured you'd think they're happy as they are. I have no right to decide whether they're happy or not. But I do know that there are plenty of demi-human races out there that do not lead lives of tribal subsistence. The people here should at least be informed of their options. Options, huh? Well, it's your country. Let's go and get your new equipment moved over. A group of undead joined them on their way out to Philagram's camp. Whip cracks echoed through the glade as the deep wardens on watch duty roused the laborers lounging about. Within a minute, dwarves were unloading the pallets of equipment, handing them off to the undead. Is there really a need for that? For what? Philagram didn't look at the human. Whipping people like that, the human said. You could have just said something. We did, Philagram replied. After we whipped them. The wardens are doing their job, girl. That's right, I said wardens. As in people that oversee criminals. You think this pile of scum is out here for a frolic in the woods? Do you believe that they'll take any steps toward reform if you treat them like that? They're not expected to achieve reform. They're here to suffer a life of hard labor and we're here to make sure that those lives go on for as long as possible. That's terrible. That's the point. He wasn't sure what her problem was. Especially considering the fact that anyone who committed the same crimes in the Sorceress Kingdom would find posthumous employment as a skeleton. The human flinched as one of the exiles was struck directly in front of her. The dwarf woman grimaced, but she trudged on with her burden, bleeding from her gashed shoulder. After a few steps, however, she stopped. A familiar sensation washed over Philagram as the dwarf woman's expression twisted. The human let out a shriek as a hand erupted from the laborer's chest in a spray of blood. The hand was followed by an arm, which was followed by a whole dwarf who somehow stepped out of the now thoroughly dead laborer. A scratching sound filled the silence following the newcomer's emergence as the elder lich at the human's shoulder took notes. Velgarth, a furrow clove Philagram's brow. What are you doing here? His daughter turned at the sound of his voice. She paid no mind to her mess as she ran forward and genuflected before him. Father, Velgarth said. We need help. What happened? I'm not sure. Everything was going according to plan. We retook the mines, repelled the initial retaliation, and cut ourselves off from Kazannar. Then Mother went to secure Harder while we fortified Filhammer. After that, I'm not sure what happened. It was quiet for a day or so. The council armies were just everywhere. They came from every direction conceivable. How many were there? Too many. The general said 500,000 as a conservative estimate. Philagram looked down silently at his daughter's blood-soaked head. Since when was Kazannar that strong? 500,000 was possible if every principality deployed all of their fighting forces, but none of them would do any such thing. They were as much at each other's throats as they were at Clan Filhammer's, so every clan would prudently withhold enough of its strength to defend against any treachery. Ba'awin never suggested that they would face anything remotely like this, Agni said. She said that the council would be willing to commit a quarter of that number, at most. Did you get a good measure of the battle slaves? Philagram asked. I did, Velgarth answered with a nod. It's the usual mix, just more than we expected. Far more. But our spies never even got a whiff of them before this. Going by that, it sounded like the council had stationed them outside of Kazannar. The underground was so expansive that one could hide an army of millions without anyone noticing. What they were doing with such a huge force on hand was the real question. It couldn't have possibly been raised just to deal with Clan Filhammer. Is Kazannar being attacked by outsiders? He asked. Not that I know of, his daughter answered. Then what do you know? Velgarth removed her leather gauntlets, shaking the blood off of them. Agni pointed a finger at her, removing the mess covering the girl with a clean spell. Thanks, Aunt Agni, Velgarth nodded, then turned back to him. Our spies started reporting that the other clans were up to something just over a month ago. Stockpiling provisions and equipment. Acting all suspicious-like. Which coincided with when we first learned that the war in Roblé was over,
Agni said.
Baldwin figured that it was spies planted in our company that reported the coming change. Yeah, so we planned accordingly,
Velgarth said.
The council was keeping us out of their meetings and everything, but why would they do that if we were being attacked by outsiders?
It didn't make any sense to him, either.
He could follow his wife's line of reasoning, but the council's unprecedented retaliation threw everything off. Did the council armies say anything when they came for us?
Aside from the stuff that you'd expect to hear, no.
They were furious that we did what we did and just wanted us dead.
How far have they advanced?
They were breaching the city when Ul'dun told me to go to you. At their current rate, it'll take a few days for the fighting to reach the citadel.
Falagram stroked his beard in thought. By now,
a small crowd had gathered around them.
Exile and guard alike spoke in low tones between themselves.
Since unreasonably massive armies didn't just appear out of nothing for no reason, Falagram was reasonably certain that there was something else going on. The entire chain of events may have been an extraordinarily unfortunate coincidence, but what was done was done.
No matter the circumstances, the council wouldn't forgive Clan Feelhammer for its actions. What he needed to do now was devise a way to secure his home and take advantage of whatever else was happening.
His eyes went to the human, who looked especially pale standing a few meters away from the pile of gore that was the former exile.
Well, then, he told her. It looks like your undead will have a chance to strut their stuff, after all. I'll be right back with the forms.